What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And we are here to completely wrap up and give you the things that you need to know and what we learned from Pro Tour Aetherdrift. We usually do these videos in kind of a three-part series. You know, we go over day 1, day 2, and we go over the top 8. This time around, with some stuff I had going on, this allows me to kind of experiment with this kind of format where we just throw everything all into one video. It's going to be a little bit longer, and you know, I get rambly and stuff like that, especially been around the channel for a while, so please bear with me. But we are going to be going over the day 1 metagame. We're going to be looking at the win rates from all the decks from the events over the course of day 1 and day 2. I even pulled up some of the players that were undefeated after day 1, and of course we're going to be going over the top 8 bracket as well till we get to our eventual winner of the event. And of course we're going to have some thoughts and opinions of how things kind of went at the very end of the video, so you can just get all the information out of the way if you really don't care about what I think. But if you do care about what I think, then please consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell, so you know when future videos get posted. We do breakdowns of these major events. We go kind of making our own predictions. I did have a prediction video for the Aetherdrift set, so be sure to check that out as well if you kind of want some of my ideas and my thoughts and stuff like that, and some things that you need to know if you go back to rewatch some of these events as well. I, of course, also do a very deep dive into the standard and modern formats, as well as those are the regional championship qualifying seasons. So please go ahead and check those out. Subscribe, leave a like on the video, all that fun stuff. And comment down below as well if you got to watch Pro Tour Aetherdrift. Let me know how you felt about the event overall, how you feel about the standard metagame, the presentation, all that fun stuff. I like to interact with the community as much as possible, and anything that really you learned from the event over the course of the weekend, you know, is also greatly appreciated down there. And finally, if you go to the description down below, I got a few links. I got one that goes to my Twitch channel where we do stream over there occasionally, trying to play a little bit more constructed. We did play a little bit of limited just because I've been enjoying the Aetherdrift set, so definitely go ahead and follow the Twitch channel as well. Maybe even subscribe over there as well if that is something that you're interested in. I also have a podcast that we do on the Casual Spikes YouTube channel with my co-host and friend Randy over at MTG with Randy, where we talk a lot about the same things. We go pretty in depth on the modern and standard formats. We go pretty deep on the regional championship, Pro Tour, World Championship, all that fun stuff, doing breakdowns and kind of giving our own thoughts and opinions on what the potential metagame would look like, maybe some of the breakout decks, stuff like that, and even talking about some of the new sets in Magic as well. So if that is something that interests you, go ahead and follow that link and subscribe over to the Casual Spikes podcast. We're actually going to be going live from here on out, hopefully, as long as things kind of go well, so we can get videos out on that same day and on a different day, so that we can get them out a little bit sooner for the audience, stuff like that. So be sure to check that out. Lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Use my code in the description down below. You can get 5% off your monthly rental subscription, so you can go and rent decks that are maybe on Moto that you are interested in playing, whether you're interested in playing the standard format, Commander, Legacy, that sort of thing. You can go ahead and use them. They have a very quick service. You know, you can rent cards like almost instantly, and you get some pretty cool rewards as you are subscribed longer than them. So be sure to check out the sponsor channel, Manatraders. I'd like to thank them once again, and let's go ahead and look at our metagame for Pro Tour Aetherdrift. So here we have our standard metagame. Now, we did do some shorts on the channel, and during our prediction video, we did kind of predict this 3-deck format here. We have Gruul Mice, Esper Pixie, and Domain Overlords as our top decks in the field. I believe there was 439 or 349 players. I believe it's 349, and we see that almost 19% of the metagame opted for Gruul Mice. Now, this is the deck that essentially plays this mouse package of Manifold Mouse, Heartfire Hero, and Emberheart Challenger that are just looking to deal massive amounts of damage to your opponent, thanks to cards like Monstrous Rage being able to not only give your creature trample while Manifold Mouse is also giving your mice double strike, but being a very powerful just pump spell. I've heard a lot of players over the weekend saying that Monstrous Rage is probably one of the best red cards, or is the best red card currently in the standard format, and kind of proving so, considering again 19% of the metagame was Gruul Mice. Of course, you have mono red aggro there towards the bottom at 3.2%, also a Monstrous Rage deck as well. So definitely a card that a lot of players put a decent amount of stock in, especially in the Gruul versions, opting for the green splash for some of the other powerful cards. I also believe playing things like the Innkeeper's Talent to kind of be a little bit grindier and make things a little bit more painful for the Esper Pixie decks and even some of the other nowhere to run decks, because nowhere to run gets around, stops ward abilities from triggering and basically ignores hexproof. So Gruul Mice is your #1 most registered deck for Pro Tour Aetherdrift. Next is Esper Pixie. This was my best deck going into the format. I thought that this was going to be the most played deck. It started out as kind of like a, is it good, is it not good? And with the Spotlight Series in Atlanta kind of being the first test of this Esper Pixie deck. And while it didn't win the event, and actually even as far as bounce decks are concerned, I believe it was the Dimir bounce deck that actually made it pretty far in here, where you can see 9 copies in the event, 2.6% of the field, where Dimir bounce was actually the deck that made it to the finals of that event and lost to a Girl Aggro deck. But Esper Pixie, I think, just offers a lot of utility. You have a lot of these different ways to bounce your different permanents and stuff. Like This Town Ain't Big Enough, is like a massive card for this deck. Of course, just getting to loop Hopeless Nightmare to make your opponent discard a card and lose 2 life. We saw a game during the Pro Tour where I think it dealt like 12, 14, 16 damage, something like that. Essentially, it made our opponent lose life. I'm sure they gained some life along the way, but just the fact that one card got replayed over and over and over again and made our opponent discard basically 6-7 cards and lose 12 to 14 life is absolutely insane, and that's the power of this Esper Pixie deck. We also have Domain Overlords, which is our 3rd most registered deck at 15.2%. This is kind of my dark horse, and what I pointed out in the shorts that we did, that I think this deck has a way of just kind of beating Hopeless Nightmare, where your opponent's trying to loop it and get a bunch of cards out of your hand. With Domain Overlords, you're able to play like Overlord of the Hauntwoods. You're able to kind of press the mana advantage there, so you can actually like play lands without having to play lands, meaning that those are kind of like free cards to discard a Hopeless Nightmare. And with the card Up the Beanstalk, in conjunction with these Overlords that you can append and actually get draws off of those Up the Beanstalks, meaning that you can just, again, have that card being replaced, and you kind of don't care because now your threat's on the board, and if your opponent just bounces it to your hand with something like This Town Ain't Big Enough, you're going to be able to then just redraw cards and get an additional land. If it's Overlord of the Hauntwoods, get an additional 2 creatures. If it's Overlord of the Mistmoors, which were like the pretty big and popular ones. There's some lists that were playing the red Overlord, which also would work, and that one deals damage, which is a little bit more painful in the short term, but definitely in the long term, the green and the white one have proved to be the best ones, and that's, again, what the players have opted to bring. And, of course, Zur kind of bringing it all together, being able to just help you gain life in chunks by animating those cards and then getting to attack with them and getting their triggers of creating an everywhere land token and making more creatures, and it just makes the battlefield a complete mess. You get to press a mana advantage that a lot of decks just don't really get, where Esper Pixie, if they have like 5, 6, 7 lands in play, it's pretty rough for them. And if you're the Domain deck and you have 6, 7 lands in play, chances are there's like 2 or 3 everywhere tokens, and you have 4 actual lands in play with a grip full of cards that are just going to continually trigger your Beanstalk and just, completely put your opponent away relatively early, as long as you can stave off a pretty aggressive draw. And kind of the surprise one next is this Jeskai Oculus deck, which we've seen plenty of blue-white Oculus where people are trying to use like Recommission and Helping Hand to be able to get those cards back into play, especially important Oculus, because this is like a card that you could get into play like on turn 2 and a lot of times on turn 3, where you can just bring it back into play. You get to get past the cost of exiling 6 cards from your graveyard by bringing it back, and then just getting to Manifest Dread on each of your opponent's turns, putting cards in your graveyard, putting hopefully a creature onto the battlefield. And with Fear of Missing Out, this allows you to play some really good red cards as well, just having red in the deck. So Fear of Missing Out is going to help you get rid of your important Oculuses. You are also playing, I think it was like Brotherhood's End, which might be the wrong card because I think that's the sweeper. But there's essentially a red enchantment that you can play that you can, ditch a card to then draw 2 cards. And eventually you can pay 1 and sacrifice to give your creatures haste. And again, with Fear of Missing Out, you're going to be able to get Delirium, attack with it, untap your important Oculus, and get to attack again with it, just getting to deal tons and tons of damage out of nowhere. And with multiple Fear of Missing Outs, you can also just again, make more of your important Oculuses and your other creatures, just be able to attack again and again, and putting your opponent, who may be at like 15, 20 life, and all of a sudden they're basically dead because there's, a board full of manifested creatures and like 1 or 2 Oculuses staring at them, no pun intended, because it's just a giant eye, but, just staring at your opponent and potentially able to just close out the game from there, especially knowing that like the Fear of Missing Out is also just going to be able to let the other creatures attack as well and help close out the game eventually. essentially, where, of course, the big thing is going to be attacking with a giant eyeball for 5-6 damage, repeated, and doing it like twice a turn. Mono red aggro, essentially the same as the Gruul Mice deck. You have a much more streamlined mana base. You get to play burn spells and stuff as like your reach, where the Gruul decks don't really have room for those kind of burn spells like Burst Lightning, Lightning Strike. Burst Lightning being the big one, just because you can pay 5 mana to deal 4 damage, and it definitely has come up from time to time. Dimir Midrange is kind of a surprising one, because this was a deck that was easily one of the top decks of the format about, I would say maybe 2 months ago. It was argued if Dimir Midrange or Golgari Midrange was better, and then Dimir Midrange just took off, and Golgari Midrange kind of started to go back into the shadows here. But now, like, Dimir Midrange is, the 6th most played deck in this event, actually tied for the 6th most with Dimir Bounce and Azorius Oculus, 2 other decks that have definitely been a lot better, I would say, in this current meta than something like Dimir Midrange. So that's something to kind of keep in mind here, as we're kind of like wading through a lot of, the results and looking at some win percentages and things like that. But, Dimir Bounce, same thing as like Esper Pixie. Your mana base is a little bit more streamlined. You can kind of do some other things as well that the Esper Pixie deck doesn't get to do. But again, at the sacrifice of not getting to play some of the good white cards, like there's a 1 mana creature that will essentially put +1/+1 counters on your creatures when an enchantment enters the battlefield or you fully unlock a room. So this is like a way that you can get, a ton of pressure with Nurturing Pixies and Fear of Isolations in the Esper deck, where you can just like play these out. You're going to be able to put counters on your creatures and on your flying creatures, no less, and get in for tons of damage early on. Your opponent's really not going to be able to do much about it. Azorius Oculus, same thing as like the Jeskai version, but playing a lot more just self-mill rather than like the Jeskai Oculus decks. Golgari Midrange, just basically your typical mid-range stuff. And Selesnya Cage was also a pretty interesting one. This being the, Collector's Cage, you get 3 more... you activate it, put a counter on something, and if you have creatures with, 3 different creatures with different power and toughness, whatever the case may be, you can play a card that's underneath of Collector's Cage without paying its mana cost, and a lot of the times you're looking to put an Overlord of the Mistmoors into play like on turn 3. So definitely pretty powerful there, and of course the other 28% of the field is the other. So this is kind of the metagame that we expected here. Jeskai Oculus, I would say, is kind of the like a weird one out of the bunch, and maybe even like Dimir Midrange having seeing as much play as like Dimir Balance and the Azorius Oculus. Even Golgari Midrange being played more than some of the other decks the players registered is pretty interesting. But, Gruul Aggro, Esper Pixie, and Domain Overlords is, I would say, the metagame that we mostly expected. And, of course, you see that by the massive drop-off from Domain Overlords to Jeskai Oculus being a little over 9% of the metagame. Definitely, being a shift. And, of course, another almost 3% of those decks as well from Jeskai Oculus to Mono Red Aggro. But, I would say a pretty good metagame overall. Even though like 15% is like a crazy percentage for any deck, and the fact that you have 3 of them, the fact that Standard is a kind of a 3-deck format, and there are some other decks that aren't necessarily, I would say, up in that tier 1, again, not getting 15% of the players to actually play the deck, but there are some really good and some really cool decks in the format, like even Mono Red, against Domain Overlords, against maybe something like Esper Pixie, where if you can just get enough damage in early on and you can just kind of tempo them out with like burn spells, things like that, Mono Red Aggro can be a solid option, as well as like Dimir Bounce as well. Scott McNamara, who ended up being the runner-up at the Spotlight Series in Atlanta, was in the thick of it, had a potential to make top 8. Maybe if just one more win definitely would have gotten him in. But that's our day 1 metagame for Standard. And we did have 2 undefeated players. Now it is 3 rounds of draft with 5 rounds of constructed. So they only played 10 rounds of constructed Magic versus 6 rounds of draft. But there are 2 players that ended up actually after day 1 ended up being 8-0, so they posted a 3-0 draft record with a 5-0 constructed record. Those 2 players being Ben Stark, who was on the right, Matt Nass on the left. Matt Nass playing the Dimir Overlords, playing the Domain Overlords deck, and we saw a bunch of it here in our metagame. 15% of the metagame. Matt Nass being one of those players, super smart, awesome player. I absolutely love watching Matt play Magic, and he just played absolutely amazing. The matches I had gotten to see over the course of the weekend. And of course, Ben Stark as well was kind of playing a deck that was a little bit off the beaten path in the Orzhov Pixie deck, where, or Orzhov, like self-balance kind of stuff, where, where most people had kind of wanted to play like blue-black, or they wanted to play, blue-black-white. He opted for black-white, and obviously started very well, having a 5-0 record in Constructed after day one. And, with all that said, let's go ahead and check out kind of our win rates, and then we're going to be getting into the top 8 of the event. So for most of the other events, for like regional championships, we usually get like a day 2 conversion rate. We figure out like what decks performed well enough in day 1 to actually get to day 2. And unfortunately, we didn't really get anything for Aetherdrift. At least there's nothing that I had seen that would indicate something like that. So we're just going to go straight to the standard win rates. So these decks are just the win rates of these decks. I don't think it takes into account mirror matches. I'm sure from Frank Carson, we're going to get a more detailed and in-depth like win rate guide, depending on, who played what deck. But here we have some of the more played decks in the format. Of course, we had Gruul Mice was 66 of the day 1 metagame, and it had a 50.8% win rate, which is pretty good. I mean, just a little bit more than half. I mean, not obviously ideal when you're a top deck of the format, or rather was like one of the most played decks, but 51% roughly is a pretty good win rate, I would say, for being the most played deck. The most surprising one to me right here, aside from Dimir Midrange having a super abysmal win rate, is Esper Pixie only having a 48.1% win rate. I know that a lot of the metagame was probably kind of targeting and figuring out ways to actually beat this Pixie deck, with the Gruul Mice deck, in most cases being a more resilient, like maybe not necessarily winning the game on like turn 3 or turn 4, but willing to play a little bit longer of a game. And try to grind a little bit with Esper Pixie to try to like get them to a point where they're not able to bounce any like real good permanents or really get really established. But either way, 48.1% of the metagame, or 48.1% win rate is not really all that great. Again, when you're the second most played deck compared to Domain Overlords, who had 5 less decks but had an almost 56% win rate, which is pretty crazy because I mean this town ain't big enough. It was considered like probably one of the best cards in Standard right now, and Domain Overlords doesn't necessarily play that card. I mean, it plays a lot of the big mana synergies. We'd seen actually like Ride Down from the Ride's End, I think is what it's called, from the Aetherdrift set, be a card that these domain decks picked up because it was a card that would exile, could exile a creature or a vehicle, and then obviously helped out with the Gruul matchup a lot because their Heartfire Hero doesn't just explode and deal a ton of damage to you. So you could play cards like that, and it would trigger up the Beanstalk as well and cost 2 mana if you targeted something that was tapped. So just a really good innovation for that deck, and again, boasting a 56% win rate. Jeskai Oculus at 53%. Mono Red Aggro having almost 6% better of a win rate than Gruul Mice. Now, I will say that typically when you see decks that have a lower deck count, it is a lot easier, I would say, for them to have a higher perceived win rate, only for the fact that, if you have like a handful of players, like if over half these players, had higher than a 56% win rate, then there's like an amount of players that are either like close to like maybe 50%, which I wouldn't say isn't really that great, a 5-5 record, but then you can have like 1 or 2 players that have like 4-6, 3-7, and they kind of get negated out by like the 9-1s, 8-2s, things like that. So definitely still having a 56.5% win rate, kind of willing to look towards Mono Red as a deck to kind of pick up and play, going forward in Standard. Dimir Midrange, again, very laughable 25.9% win rate when you look at all these other decks on this screen here, where the next lowest one is Golgari Midrange at 43.5. When everyone said Golgari Midrange was like one of the worst decks to play, it posted an impressive 43.5%, when compared to Dimir Midrange, when we were just talking about 2 months ago, roughly, that, Dimir Midrange was the superior midrange deck to Golgari Midrange. So, I guess congrats to Golgari Midrange and boohoo to the Dimir fans. But Dimir Bounce, 45%, Azorius Oculus almost at 50%. And the rest of the field having a 49.4% win rate. Selesnya Cage about at a 45%. I mean, this is kind of, again, like when you have more decks seeing play, I think the biggest surprise of all this is like Domain Overlords and Jeskai Oculus. I think Jeskai Oculus was a deck that I don't think most people really had on their radar quite potentially. I mean, it's been a hot minute since we really dived super deep into standard here, but Just Got Oculus to me was kind of like the weird one, and even like Mono Red Aggro, having the best win rate of all the decks here. Again, having 42 less decks does help, but Domain Overlords, I would say being the biggest surprise. 53 players playing it, third most played deck in the format. Definitely the highest among the big three here, and almost super close to being on the same level as the Mono Red Aggro deck. So very interesting overall. Again, this is kind of going to give us a good idea of what we can expect players in the early days of this set. If you're going to be playing on Magic Online, or maybe you're going to play on Magic Arena, a lot of players are probably going to be gravitating towards this Domain Overlords deck because it absolutely put on a clinic this weekend, while Esper Pixie and Gruul Mice just kind of, it played their role a little bit. They looked really good on camera when they were on camera, but they also, didn't perform all that well given the amount of players like picking up and playing this deck. While some of the other less played decks definitely, I would say, punched above their weight a little bit in like Just Got Oculus and the Mono Red Aggro. But, to a lot of people, though, this doesn't really matter unless it converts into something. So let's go ahead and take a look at our top 8 bracket and kind of see our breakdown of, what decks actually were able to convert these into top 8 finishes and hopefully aren't on the outside looking in. So keeping in mind here, this is our top 8 bracket here. Matt Nass is our 1 seed. Ian Robb is the 8th seed. It was Domain Overlords versus a Mono Red Aggro here. Definitely giving a nod to Ian Robb because Mono Red, usually these kind of super fast, aggressive decks are a lot better against the Domain decks than you would see from like Esper Pixie, even some of the Gruul variants where they're trying to play a little bit more mid-rangey, a little less of the protection spells and just more of like the go wide-ish, like get some value sort of decks that, we see from, essentially trying not to get blown out by a lot of the self-bounce stuff going on. Then you have Lucas Ducau playing Gruul Leyline, which we actually saw in the finals of the Atlanta event in January, where people were, again, there's kind of like this camp, or like 2 camps of Gruul players where you just have regular Gruul aggro and like these other regular aggro decks that are just trying to, get some of the valiant value from playing the mice. And then you also have the Gruul Leyline players, where Leyline has a way more explosive draw. It's going to close out the game very quickly, can win as early as turn 2. Definitely it's not a meme. You can absolutely win the game on turn 2 with a Gruul Leyline deck, which is something that, when you're playing Domain, you want to play, like one of your tap Surveil lands on turn 1, because then all your Verges are going to be able to tap for both colors of mana, and you're going to have untap. But sometimes against this deck, you could just die to a Leyline deck on turn 2 and you have a tap land in play. Next we have Zevin Faust versus Yu Chen Lu. Golgari Graveyard versus Gruul Mice. Golgari Graveyard was definitely I would say the talk of the tournament. Like, this deck was absolutely nuts. I believe Zevin tested with the Nerd Range Gaming team, and a lot of them were playing Mono Red, including Ian Robb, who was one of the teammates on that team. And Zevin decided to go with this Golgari Graveyard deck, and honestly, it looked really sweet the times it was on camera. Essentially getting to play up the Beanstalk, and all these creatures that care about having creatures in your graveyard, because they cost 1 less for each creature in your graveyard. And then getting to play them for like 1 or 2 mana to then get to draw cards and kind of get some value. And you just end up putting a board full of just big creatures in play. And it's a lot harder for some of those decks to really come back from that sort of thing. Like when you put a 5/4 into play and you draw 2 cards, and then you put another 5/4 into play and draw 2 cards, and you put a 6/6 into play and draw 2 cards, and so on and so on. A lot of like what these Domain decks are doing, then, this Graveyard deck just kind of gets to do that, but it ramps it up to 11 and just, again, puts big bodies into play that you're just going to keep drawing cards off of. I think Gruul Mice is kind of what we have seen from these other Gruul aggro decks. So we have 3 different aggro decks in here, where we have the Mono Red aggro, which is probably more the traditional Mono Red aggro. We have Gruul Leyline, which is kind of on the extreme end of these aggro decks. And then you have Gruul Mice, which is in that Gruul aggro camp, where this is kind of the more traditional aggro deck. And then finally, we have Kenta Harane on Just Got Oculus versus James Dimitrov on Domain Overlords here. And I believe, this is, again, all the Overlords list. So really quickly, Matt Nass, number 1 seed overall, playing Domain. I believe Lucas Ducau was the 4th seed. I believe 4th seed. I think that they would be 1, 8, 4, and 5, and then like Zevin, Yu Chen Liu is 2-7, and then we have Kenta Hirane and James Dimitrov at 3 and 6 seeds. So here we have 3 different Domain Overlord decks. We have 4 total Beanstalk decks if you include the Golgari Graveyard deck. Of course, we have Jeskai Oculus, which is kind of like the oddball deck, I would say, of the 7 here. Even though like Gruul Leyline is obviously in this top 8 as well, is pretty interesting. But all these decks trying to do most of these decks trying to do different things. Again, like Zevin trying to play a little bit more with the graveyard and getting to use up the Beanstalk to kind of keep the engine going of just playing these really cheap big creatures. We have all the Domain Overlord decks that are just looking to slam the door firmly shut on a lot of the aggro decks and just go bigger than any other mid-range deck that's in the format. We have the different versions of aggro where Gruul Mice is a little bit more traditional. Gruul Leyline just trying to end the game faster than anybody else can possibly end the game, and then Mono Red just looking to deal enough damage in the early turns where they can use their burn spells to kind of close out the games here. And here in a minute, we'll be transitioning to basically how these quarterfinals ended up playing out in the semifinals that we ended up actually getting. So these were the results from the top 8 quarterfinals. So Matt Nass beat Ian Robb 3-1. Ian Robb mulliganed to 5 cards in game 1, and then I believe in game 4, Ian Robb just hardcore flooded out. Matt Nass was able to just control the board, do the Domain Overlords thing, and win the match there. So I would say kind of gifted 2 games, but definitely that's how just top 8 matches go sometimes. Ian Robb had good amounts of opportunities of cards that he could have drawn to win the game, and just unfortunately did not get there. Matt Nass also navigated it pretty well in game 4, where he was probably going to be dead to certain things and just playing around them when he needed to, just to not be dead off the top to something like Sunspine Lynx, which has been a card that a lot of the red-based decks have been kind of playing to punish a lot of the Domain Overlord decks, because this is going to deal a damage for each non-basic land, and that player or each player controls, which can deal a ton of damage to the Domain Overlords deck when they just play a bunch of non-basics, and their their green Overlord ends up making non-basic lands as well. But Matt Nass winning that 3-1, moving on to the semifinals, where he played the winner of the Lucas Ducau and Christopher Leonard matchup. Overlord versus Gruul Leyline. Again, another aggro deck that I would say is favored here. I would say Gruul Leyline is just an insane deck that, just completely blows most people out of the water, just because if you don't have turn 1 interaction for these cards, you are just at the potential of dying to them. But didn't matter. Lucas Ducau kind of had the Leyline start in game 1 and couldn't really finish it off with really much of anything, and that's kind of how most of the games went. So that Christopher Leonard was just kind of on top of it for the whole game. Didn't really seem like not in that much control, or it didn't seem like he didn't have control necessarily of the game. So ended up winning that 3-1. We go to the other side of the bracket. We have Kenta Hirane versus James Dimitrov. Jeskai Oculus versus Domain Overlords. Went the distance, 5 games, and in the end, our Domain Overlords have successfully won and had beaten Jeskai Oculus 3-2. Didn't get to watch too much of this match. There's nothing really notable I can remember. There was kind of this cool thing where, I think it was, or maybe, no, it would have been the other game, I believe. But, I've seen, like, Kenta Hirane had some pretty cool plays there with, like, double fear of missing out, being able to, like, attack down, like, Planeswalkers and stuff to be able to make the top 8. So this Jeskai Oculus is a really cool deck, and maybe I would be interested in trying this out on the channel as well, because, again, it just seems like it's a really cool deck. But Overlords moving on, and we'll face the winner of Golgari Graveyard versus Gruul Mice. Another 5-game set. I think Golgari Graveyard is supposed to be favored in this. I'm not exactly sure the details of Zevin Faust's list, but I will have kind of the top 8 players and a little bit of a bio and their deck list posted in the description down below. But Yu Chen Liu ended up winning with Gruul Mice 3-2 against Zevin Faust. Great run for Zevin. I mean, this Golgari Graveyard deck was absolutely insane. A bunch of people talking about it, but just as most things go, the Gruul aggro deck just ruining the fun for everybody. Basically meaning that like aggro went 1-2 in the top, or in the top 8 quarterfinals. With honestly, the surprising thing to me is that the Leyline deck wasn't the one that actually won of the 3. Where I would have expected maybe Gruul Mice to have a little bit harder of a time. Even if it didn't have to play against one of the Overlord, the Domain decks, and Gruul Leyline having to play against one of the Domain decks, which is kind of the matchup it wants to play, just not being able to get it done. So pretty interesting there. But that sets us up for Domain Overlord Mirror on one side of the bracket and Domain Overlords and Gruul Mice on the other side. So we started with James Dimitriov and Yuchen Liu in the quarterfinals, just because I would imagine that for them, if they ended up seeing James win, they weren't going to get Overlord Mirror into Overlord Mirror. And it was a good thing they did, because Matt Nass and Christopher Leonard played a 2-hour game, and we'll get back to it. But James Dimitriov and Yuchen Liu, I believe, ended up going 4 games. It ended up going like 4 or 5 games, but in the end, James Dimitriov ended up winning that and securing his spot in the finals, where we go to the other side, Matt Nass, Christopher Leonard. Unfortunately, I didn't really get to watch any of this. I guess I didn't really get to watch much of the semifinals, just from stuff that we had going on. But in the end, Matt Nass, after a 2-hour battle, goes to the finals and faces James Dimitriov in the finals. And this was amazing. This is great, because this was also another like 1.5, 2-hour banger of a match, with the domain mirror match going on here. And I don't think it's a surprise who won. Maybe it is. But Matt Nass ends up actually winning and taking down the event after, going back-to-back, played a 2-hour match and won a very tough mirror match to play, going into essentially the same thing into the next round. And when you've played as much Magic as Matt Nass or even James has played, but, take it from, like, James' perspective, like, also beating, kind of I would say maybe a mid-rangey kind of deck in Jeskai Oculus, and having to go play against Gruul Mice, having a little bit of, like, a breakup of, like, the different matchups, where Matt Nass playing against Mono Red, kind of the same thing, playing against the aggro matchup, having to play a very, very tough mirror match, against Christopher Leonard, and then having to go and play another mirror match in the finals, and being able to maintain enough focus. Like, to me, at least, there wasn't any like outward like mistakes, I would say, that Matt Nass made in the finals, where James, definitely there were some missteps along the way there, but of course pushed it to 5 games, where Matt Nass ended up winning it 3-2 and becoming a one-time Pro Tour champion after making multiple top 8s and winning multiple Grand Prix as well, when they were called Grand Prix. We now know them as Spotlight Series events. But overall, this is a pretty amazing top 8, and we'll kind of shift gears here, and we'll talk about some of the things that I really liked from the event. But congratulations to Matt Nass, congratulate all the top 8 players and all the players that got to participate in the Pro Tour. It was an awesome event overall. And with that said, let's go ahead and look at some notes and kind of talk about the impact that this is going to have on Standard and those sort of things. So overall, I was a pretty big fan of the event. Of course, every time we have a Pro Tour, World Championship, Regional Championship, whatever the case may be, whoever is putting on the show, I think it ends up being fantastic. I think Riley Knight was a very good person to slot into kind of the commentator role, or not really the commentator role, but into that desk role. I would love to see him be a commentator, but of course, I think Ailey and Corey, and of course, Marshall and Paul Cheon are very good commentators on their own. I definitely think the energy is there. I personally prefer Riley Knight over most of the people that they end up having commentating, but maybe we can see Riley kind of move into that role maybe later. But a fine addition to him on the broadcast team, with Cedric taking on his new role in Wizards as kind of like the competitive play design person. So definitely an awesome person to fill that void that Cedric left, even though Cedric again was more of a, like, I would say more of like the commentating crew with either Paul Cheon or I believe Marshall as well. So definitely cool to see there. But yeah, the event overall as a whole, fantastic. A lot of great Standard matches being played. And, going forward, I think Standard is going to be in a fantastic place. Of course, we have Modern being the next set of Regional Championship qualifiers. But with some of the Standard sets that are coming down the pipeline, and of course, Modern is going to be kind of like the next one, but Standard, I believe, is like the next 2. I believe the format's going to be in a pretty great place and is going to be a lot of fun to play years to come, even with, more sets being added where, we have more sets in the format for longer. We have Foundation Foundations was going to be a part of the format for about 5 years, and there's some pretty cool Foundations cards that we saw in the feature match and, involved with a lot of these decks. So Standard's going to be interesting for not only the short term being this season, but for the seasons to come as well. But overall, I have a few different kind of like headlines, if you want to call them, for this event. One of them being you can't spell dominant without domain. Really don't think about it too hard, honestly. Domain absolutely crushed it this weekend. 3 copies in the top 8. We had a mirror match in the finals. We had a mirror match in the semifinals. They just absolutely converted at a crazy rate. And, you can't ask for anything more than that, especially at the Pro Tour. I mean, when you have a deck like Nadu, who ended up putting like a bunch of copies in the top 8 of its Pro Tour, and then, mirror matches throughout the rest of the day after the quarters, is basically like where you want to be, well, not necessarily where you want to be at in terms of a healthy format, but in terms of, feeling good about the deck you registered, just being like, hey, like it just wasn't my weekend maybe, but, I definitely registered the right deck for the format, and it looks like Domain definitely did what we thought it was going to do. It was going to be able to have some of the card advantage tools to kind of be able to beat some of the like pixie draws where they're just going to recur Hopeless Nightmare over and over again. And it had a lot of the good tools that you needed against the aggro decks to, again, take some damage when you needed to, but then boom, you're gaining 13, 14 life a turn. You're right back up to 20 life. Your opponent's got 1 or 2 cards in hand and essentially no battlefield, along with having a bunch of different rats and removal spells that are super efficient where you're going to be able to double spell and again, continue to draw cards, keep them flowing to be able to control the game. Domain doing exactly what it does best, winning its second Pro Tour in the time that it's been legal in the legal in the standard format. And, that's great. Any deck that ends up getting the trophy at the end of the weekend is awesome and really couldn't have happened to a better player in Matt Nass, which again, congratulations to him winning the event. Second bullet point here, self-bounce ends up taking a step back here. So this is a deck, to me, was the best going into the format. I think the efficiency of it, and if you had a draw where you only had like 3 or 4 lands, like, yeah, you were kind of fine with drawing more in the Esper variants, especially because you end up having like this town ain't big enough, plus Storm Chaser's talent, like kind of loops where you could just bounce your opponent's thing, bounce Storm Chaser's talent, play another one, make another 1/1, pay mana, buy back the this town ain't big enough, and just kind of keep doing that sort of thing to the point where, okay, well, now I can start bouncing 2 things, and, Storm, again, this town ain't big enough just being one of the best cards being playing in the format right now. Didn't perform as well. Of course, we saw kind of the win rate and stuff, like 48%-ish, and then Dimir having, around a 48, 49%, but below 50% win rate for the self-bounce decks, and, again, at the rate that they were both played at, it just kind of is a little disappointing. There were some players that were doing very well with these self-bounce decks against Scott McNamara with the Dimir bounce deck, and Etienne Egeschweiler, probably my favorite name of a player on the Pro Tour, also had plenty of win-ins to make the top 8, with Esper Pixie, and just could not get it done. So while this deck was very close to putting 1 or 2 copies in the top 8, or like this kind of archetype putting that many players into the top 8, it just couldn't convert, especially again with ETN having multiple chances of being able to qualify and not being able to do so is really disheartening. And definitely the self-balance deck, and maybe some of the players need to kind of take stock of what's going on. Maybe it's just a case of how the metagame kind of shook out, because again, when it comes mid-range on mid-range, usually the bigger deck wins, and nothing goes bigger than Domain. So a little bit under the gun there, but, again, this is kind of the deck that had the target on its head, so maybe it's just kind of a combination of all those things where it just didn't have the weekend that, at least that I thought it was going to have, and I would believe that most of the players thought it was going to have. Next point, traditional mid-range decks are probably bordering on unviable at this point. We talked about when we were talking about the metagame for day 1, we had seen that Dimir and Golgari mid-range had like 17 or 18 decks between the two of them registered, and, at least it was up there enough to where it was actually registering on the metagame page rather than just being in the others category, where I think mid-range has definitely looked to be more of this like self-balance kind of card advantage-y type of way, or, you're real aggro and maybe you're playing like a turn or 2 slower, just to have a little bit more staying power on the board. And of course, Domain just going super huge. Domain, again, going bigger than most of the other mid-range decks, so you had to be doing something relatively powerful. And the Dimir / Esper self-balance decks do have this option of being aggressive. So when you do play against the domain decks, you can, get some cards out of their hands, make a decent amount of, put a decent amount of power on the board, try to hit them for a bunch of damage, and get to a point where maybe just bouncing a hopeless nightmare ends up kind of finishing out the game. But I think traditional mid-range decks are basically unviable in this format. I mean, we saw that the Dimir decks had like a 25%, 26% win rate overall. That's an absolutely incredibly low win rate for a deck that at one point I think was considered one of the best decks in the format. Whether it was a month or two ago, doesn't matter. This deck was awesome. Same thing with Golgari mid-range. It was like the second or third lowest win rate of the decks that they actually showed on the graphic and everything like that. And while I think these decks are probably okay to take to your RCQ, depending on how spiky I would say that your meta is, if you're a pretty good pilot, compared to some of the other players, I mean, odds are you're not going to be playing in a room full of players at like the Pro Tour / World Championship caliber play. So maybe you can get away with playing these decks at like an RCQ level. But if we were to take these to like a regional championship or above, like I just would not bother. I would play literally anything else at this point. Especially again, if you have a lot of, reps in with these mid-range decks, I just don't think that there's enough there that you can actually confidently take these decks and I would say expect to do well, where it kind of is like a change of tune for me, because I know in Modern, even if your deck isn't necessarily tier 1, it's kind of worth playing it. If some of the ins and outs, maybe your opponent doesn't really know the matchup. But for something like Standard, it's just a lot easier to play the best deck, play like one of the like 2 or 3 best decks in the format, get a lot of reps in, practice the mirror, that sort of thing, rather than playing, something that's maybe a little bit off the beaten path, unless there's no physical way that you can actually do that. Lastly, I want to talk about some of the new players that made the most of their opportunities, with Zevin and Ian Robb both being players that were on the same testing team, both playing their first Pro Tours, both making the top 8, with Zevin being the number 2 seed overall, being, just a round behind Matt Nass for, auto-qualifying for the top 8. Ian Robb getting in there on breakers at 8th is absolutely amazing, and we've seen a lot of new players just kind of come into the scene. We also have a lot of players that have been around for a while that end up, doing very well. We have had Javier Dominguez, who ended up winning the World Championship. We've had players like, of course, I can't remember his name as soon as it comes up, but oh shoot, I'm gonna remember it by the end of this, I swear. But with Zevin and Ian both being in their first Pro Tour, ended up making the top 8, didn't make it past the quarters, but playing against Matt Nass, one of the more established players on the pro scene, hadn't played a lot since COVID, and even said it himself. But even before COVID, was an absolute merchant at these big events, and just proved that he's still a fantastic player. And then of course Zevin, I believe, also playing against Yucheng Liu, I believe. I absolutely butchered that name, I'm sure, because I just don't have it up in front of me. But, again, both really good players. There was also some other players that were kind of highlighted throughout the event as that kind of being their first Pro Tour. Scott McNamara being the same person that ended up being the runner-up in Atlanta, that ended up also performing very well, getting a top 32 finish at the Pro Tour, which is nothing to sneeze at, because honestly, if I were to somehow stumble my way into the Pro Tour, I'd probably be towards the bottom. Like, I'd be happy if I won like 1 or 2 matches at like the Pro Tour level, and even then I think that would be like a gross overstatement of like where my ability would be as a player, like playing in that sort of event, just because like the environment is definitely different. You're playing against a lot of players that put in all this time testing, have review the ins and outs of every single thing, and for a lot of the times when you come up with something, I would say 99% of the time someone else has had that idea and has had a remarkable amount of time to kind of like refine, tune, and really focus in on that one fact to determine if it's like good or not. So but that being said, again, like a lot of these new players made, the most of their opportunity and everything. Again, making top 8 is absolutely no small feat. Auto qualifying for the World Championship with that top 8, and congratulations to all of them. I mean, like, absolutely, again, making the most of that opportunity. And yeah, that's going to do it for this video. I think that's kind of like a lot of the stuff that we've learned from this event. I think going forward, Domain is definitely going to be the deck to beat. I think people are still going to be playing a lot of the decks that we saw here. Maybe there's going to be more eyes on like this Just Guy Oculus deck and get a little bit more innovation there. Maybe it'll be a deck that we can see towards like the tier 1, maybe bordering on like tier 1.5 status as we kind of get closer towards the end of the standard season. And and we kind of start gearing up for more of the modern regional championships that are going to be taking place throughout the rest of the month. We still have one more in the United States with I believe a handful more going on around the world, qualifying for the next Pro Tour. And of course, ending the standard RCQ season and getting ready for modern RCQ season, which also means that at some point during the modern RCQ season, we're going to have standard regional championships. And it's just going to be crazy. There's a lot of competitive Magic and stuff going on. And if you want to be in the loop on all that stuff, we're going to be talking about a lot of the major regional championships, Pro Tours, all those kinds of things going on right here on this channel, of course, on the Casual Spikes podcast. So please subscribe to this one. Go over there, subscribe to that channel as well. Subscribe to Randy. He's doing a lot of work over there on his channel, as well as being a part of the podcast, and we do greatly appreciate any and all that support. Again, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below how what you felt about Pro Tour Aetherdrift. I really want to hear your thoughts, opinions in the comments down below. Maybe how you feel about the metagame currently. Any and all that stuff is appreciated. But that's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.